okay. I'm going to let him pass through first. All right, is this on? Yeah. Yeah, there you go. I know. Those buttons. It's okay. All right. All right, if the House Education Committee will come to order, and if members will please take their seats. If members will record their attendance on the electronic voting system, the clerk will open the roll. All right, if all members recorded their attendance, clerk will close the roll. We do have a quorum. All right, as I mentioned on Monday, today we are going to deal with the recommendations from the Select Committee on School Safety. And in fact, I brought since we have the speaker here and a former teacher and many professional teachers, here is the study. So I brought that as a visual for everybody to see. So obviously a lot of work has gone into the recommendations related to this Select Committee. As you know, as I mentioned on Monday, I determined since the Select Committee, I believe, is similar to Standing Committee. Obviously, in the House of Delegates, we've only had one of these in the last since the last 150 years. It is an important issue and topic. Believe that these bills should be considered in full committee. We do have a number of them today that we're going to consider, but I've invited the chairman of the House Select Committee on School Safety, the gentleman who created the House Select Committee on School Safety, our Speaker of the House, Delegate Kirk Cox, to basically come and just talk about the importance of the work and a little bit about the recommendations you're going to see not only today in House Education, but you'll see in other committees. And I know you're no stranger to issues related to education, having been a former teacher, and we welcome you here this morning and really appreciate you spending the time with us before we get started on these recommendations and these pieces of legislation we're going to consider.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me say, Steve, personally, thank you for your not only great work on the Education Committee and just some real groundbreaking work with your retreats and a lot of things you've done to really, I think, bring to the forefront some of these key K-12 issues, but just personally your work on the Select Committee, especially as one of my subcommittee chairmen. Also, at the audience, Delegate Rush was also crucial with that delegate piece. She never started getting into names. A lot of you are sitting in here were tremendous help with the Select Committee. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, when I was sort of contemplating this, it was the idea was to do a Select Committee, and as you mentioned, 150 years. Barry Knight said he was around then. I don't think he was, but the reason I did it that way is because school safety has so many different facets, and so we had members of HWI, Education, Courts of Justice. Really felt like we need to sort of bring that expertise from all walks of life. We had some junior members, some senior members, et cetera. It was certainly bipartisan. We wanted to make sure, obviously that was something that was a hallmark. So the final report, I think a lot of you know, was released in December. It has 24 main recommendations. You're going to be hearing a lot of those today. So hopefully they'll get a pretty favorable treatment. What I thought was also interesting, good news for Virginia, was during one of the committee hearings, we had JLARC come by, and they did some research on what are other states doing, and are we doing a good job? And one of the good news was they would say that in so many different areas, Virginia was a leader. And I would say, I'm trying to remember exactly the quote, but probably around in the top 5 of states on school safety. Whenever you say something like that, though, you always can get better, and I think especially on a topic like this. So here are some of the examples of some of our priorities. Realign the roles and responsibilities of school counselors to emphasize direct student services. And we found out, and a lot of you know this, that oftentimes counselors are doing everything but working directly with students, and that could be proctoring tests, et cetera. So that was a key part. Create a statewide tip line for mental health and suicide prevention. The funding issue, you'll be dealing with all the policy issues, but there'll be some key funding issues like increasing funding for the Center for School and Campus Safety. Also looking at things like our SRO fund and our infrastructure fund. Let me just conclude with this because you got a lot of business. I really wanted this to be a do something committee, and I really think it has been that. I love the voluminous report that you had up there, and I think it just shows that how many really great ideas. This will be a template, not just for this year. I think we'll get a lot done this year. I think this will be a blueprint going forward. So as we go forward, a lot of these ideas, I think we can keep going back to and back to and back to. So with that, just want to thank you all for the opportunity to be in front of you. Mr. Chairman, once again, thanks for the work that you do. And I do really feel like we can have a great impact for both our students, parents, and teachers in the years to come. So appreciate the opportunity.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Thank you for your leadership with this issue and so many more. And we look forward to considering these bills this morning.
Great. You have a great day.
All right. The first in the queue is Delegate Knight with House Bill 1725.
Mr. Chairman, on 1725, I have a small amendment that I believe maybe Mr. Bremer has.
Ryan, if you can hand that out. Delegate Knight, why don't you explain the essence of the legislation, and then we'll consider your amendment.
Yes, sir. What the essence of the legislation is that when we build a school, it might seem fairly obvious to everybody, but when we build a school, we want the school board to be in consultation with the local building official and the fire marshal to development the procurement plan to ensure that all security enhancements to the public schools are in compliance with the Uniform State Building Code. So we want to make sure the school is built correctly, but we want to make sure that these security enhancements are in there because, of course, our committee was a school safety select committee. The amendment, sir, when we said the local building official, which everybody has one, and the local fire marshal, some localities don't have a local fire marshal. They're dependent on a state fire marshal. So my amendment says with the local building official, the state or local fire marshal. So we're just including the word state in there along with local when it pertains to fire marshal.
Okay, so it would be on line 25 of the introduced bill after and insert the state or. So it would be the local or the state at that point. Do I hear a motion on the line amendment? Second. All right, there's a motion and a second to adopt the line amendment. Any members have questions regarding that line amendment? All right, all those in favor of adopting the line amendment, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed? All right, the line amendment's adopted. Does any member have a question for Delegate Knight regarding the legislation? All right. Is there anyone in the audience that wishes to speak in favor of House Bill 1725? And I believe I see somebody coming.
Good morning, distinguished members of the House. My name is Mike Riley. I'm the Executive Director of the Virginia Department of Fire Programs, and I oversee the State Fire Marshal's Office. And thank you so much for this consideration today. In the early 70s, the U.S. Fire Administration wrote an article, a study on America burning, and it really talked about how many fires occur in the United States and how many people lose their lives. And at the time, we were losing about 10,000 Americans each year. Many of those were students in schools. So the evolution of today's fire code and building code is really to address that very significant factor. Today, we lose about 3,000 Americans due to fires. Recently, we had a school built that did not consult with the local fire marshal and wound up putting in devices that were in complete violation of the statewide fire prevention code. And so it's our effort to prevent that from occurring in the future by working closely with the building official and the schools to make sure that the schools that are being built today are concurrent with today's fire code and the prevention measures. So thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, sir. Is there anyone else in the audience that wishes to speak in favor of the legislation? Is there anyone in the audience that wishes to speak in opposition to the legislation? All right. Any members of the committee have any further questions? What's your pleasure on the bill? All right, I hear a motion and a second to report as amended House Bill 1725. All those in favor or opposed to the legislation, please record your vote on the electronic voting system. All right, all members voted. The clerk will close the roll. That bill reports as amended 20-0. Thank you, Delegate Knight.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Delegate Krizik is next with House Bill 1752.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 1752 also is a recommendation from the Speaker's Select Committee on School Safety, and it just simply mandates that no local school board will require students to attend school on Election Day, the general election, the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Currently, there's 33 counties that have schools open on Election Day, and or closed on Election Day, and 5 counties that are open. So this would just make it so that all of them would be closed. And you know, it's a safety hazard. There should be no students should be in a school when there's strangers present. And I think it's just a common sense fix. That's all I've got to say.
Seems pretty straightforward. So, Delegate, you mentioned there are 30 school systems that are closed already and
33.
33?
Yep.
Okay. And 5 that are currently open, so it would only impact those 5?
Correct, but it would impact everybody. I mean, right now it's
Right.
it's you know it's
Optional.
Optional, right?
Okay. All right. Any questions of the committee for the delegate regarding the legislation? If you can use your request to speak, that would help. All right, Delegate Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just as a curiosity, when this was discussed, was it considered about relocating the polling places rather than closing the schools?
No, there wasn't that much discussion about it. I mean, it's difficult already to find polling places. There's, in a lot of I mean, the schools are the best locations, really, in many areas. Folks know the school, they know where to go. It's kind of the community center oftentimes, where folks use the schools for other things after they're closed, for meetings and things like that in the library or in the cafeteria. So it's the natural place, and not all polling places are schools, of course, but it's difficult enough. I know in my district, we've got some precincts that don't even have a school, and we have a real tough time trying to find something that works.
Delegate Keem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a question for the patron. It's not directly related to this bill, but about the topic that he is raising, and I wonder if I can ask him maybe a couple of questions. First, Mr. Chairman, the bill as written deals only with the general election, and the way you do it, you don't actually reference election, but you talk about the first Tuesday after the first Monday, which traditionally is the day that elections are held. Has there been any thought put about whether schools should adopt similar policies consistently across the Commonwealth for primary elections? And the reason I bring this up, as a delegate might know, is Fairfax County Elections Board had sent a letter around to us a few months ago suggesting that might be something that we should be looking into, because primary elections, at least in some larger counties like Fairfax County, also create the same concerns about having people on the campus that don't necessarily belong and such. So any thoughts on
Delegate
that?
Keem, I can actually answer that question for you.
Oh.
You will see a recommendation from the Select Committee that's going to P&E to move the primary date, and I know because I actually am carrying the bill, to move the primary date from the second to the third Tuesday, and all schools are out at that point. So we're trying to address both primaries, and this is to address the general election.
Okay, so that bill wouldn't be coming here. It'd be going to P&E.
No.
Okay, thank you.
Delegate Bell.
Mr. Chairman, I don't mean to belabor this, but I'm wondering if this would also apply to May elections.
You mean the primary elections?
No, I mean May elections, local May elections. Would this also be applicable?
It doesn't, but and you could I mean, that could be an amendment if you're interested, but I prefer that we just keep this as it is.
Well, that would be up to the committee if you want to. It doesn't deal with the May election. It just deals with the November election. Delegate Bell, would you like to propose an amendment to include the May election as well?
Mr. Chairman, I would, because we're simply moving the problem from November to May. It looks like if we don't do that.
Did the patron have any problem with
So we would-
friendly
so-
amendment?
Yeah, so how would this look as far as the language?
Well, I believe that our handy-dandy staff attorney is working on a proposed amendment right now that we could consider.
So are you talking about like presidential primaries as well?
The primary election is a separate bill, which will be taken care of in P&E.
Right.
This is just dealing with closing schools.
So you're talking
during
about
the
like
general election
local May, okay, because we don't have, I'm not familiar with those. We don't have any May elections back. But I guess some folks do. Okay.
Mr.
Yeah,
Chair?
I accept that as a friendly amendment. Thank you.
Okay, we've got a lot of folks that want to weigh in on this, so let's do this properly. Let me see what a proposed amendment would look like, at least so we could hear that. It hasn't been proposed yet. But Delegate Cole, do you have a point of order?
Yeah,
or-
well, no, I was just going to propose language.
Okay,
You could make it so that instead of specifying a month or a particular election, you could just make it any general election.
that would probably work. I'll let Ryan consider that at this point. Do you want to propose that as a?
I would leave it up to council I don't want to impose on council awkward language if it, would make it more awkward.
Let's see what Ryan has come up with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Delegate Cole, I think that would be fine. I would just want to confirm with the council P&E committee after this meeting. But I think we can just, after on line 43, strike the rest of the new language and insert day on which any general election is held.
I move that amendment.
Okay, there's a proposed amendment, and it's been properly seconded. Do we have a question about the proposed amendment? I've got Delegate Keane. Do you have a question on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, yes, sir, I do, because
Okay.
I'm not an expert on the election laws, but my understanding is that local town elections, for example, which I have in my district in town of Vienna, I don't know if the right terminology is general election as opposed to a local municipal election, whereas general election is generally in the context of elections where you have parties who nominate candidates from both sides. And as you know, a lot of the local races are not party-driven, but by independent. And so I'm not sure if the word general would apply. But my other reason I brought this up was because the May elections generally are much smaller in scale, and we don't use schools, at least in my district, we don't use schools. We use the community center for that election. So it wouldn't affect the schools anyway.
All right, Delegate Bulova.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess I'm a little nervous about doing something like this on the fly, and I'll give you an example. So the city of Fairfax has their elections in May. Our school system is run by the county of Fairfax, and so the language in here would imply that the entire school board, the entire school system would have to go ahead and shut down for the city of Fairfax's May elections. And even if they didn't go ahead and do that, I think we could come up with examples all over the place of any town election within a county, you'd wind up with that exact same situation. And so, again, I understand the thought behind wanting to make that change. I think there's a lot of potential unintended consequences, and I would hate to make that decision here today without having really thought that through thoroughly, as the Select Committee has over the last year.
We can do that, but Delegate Sullivan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just building on Delegate Bulova's point, I'm wondering if we could hear before we act on this from anyone in the audience from local school boards. I'm worried about
And
piling
Delegate
holidays
Sullivan,
onto these schedules. which
Delegate
will then-
Sullivan, we'll definitely do that. And I neglected to welcome you to the committee this morning, so
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
welcome aboard.
My concern, Mr. Chairman, is that we're piling holidays into the school calendar, which at the moment, at least by law, has to start after Labor Day, and we'll be driving school deep into June. So that's my concern about doing this at the last minute, as suggested by Delegate Bulova. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we do have a proposed amendment before us, and is, do the proposers wish to have a vote on the amendment?
If you want, I'll withdraw or take the amendment by. I mean, it sounds like it may need more work and thought, and like I said, I'm not sure that we might not ought to, I'm not making this motion, might ought to take this bill by for the day so we can work on it a little bit.
Can I
Delegate
speak to
Krizek.
that, Mr. Chairman? I would just reassert that, this is something that we vetted over the whole summer from the Select Committee. And this language, they decided to narrow it to the general election because that's the day when there's a lot of folks that are at the schools, and it was for the safety of the kids. And that I think, the amendment is, and I understand it and I accepted it, but it does have all kinds of unintended consequences, and it's really another bill. That could be another bill that you could introduce, but this one really stands on its own, and I think we could certainly pass this, and you could always come back with an expansion on it next year if you wanted to include the May municipal elections. And there's a lot of folks who would like to speak against the amendment, apparently.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair.
I've got Delegate Hurst, then Delegate Yancey, then Delegate Pogge.
Mr. Chairman, I don't want to belabor the point, but to the patron statement, we're trying to amend Title 22 here, and for general elections in November, it is prescribed in code that it shall be, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. I've looked through Title 24, and I can't find any reference, while we do have May general elections, that it's not specified to be any particular day after a particular day in May. And I think it would probably be up to the charter of that town or of that city to prescribe when that day would be. And I just, not being an expert on all matters, privileges, and elections, and trying to wade into Title 24, I think that we should stick with the bill as it's currently formed, although I do certainly appreciate the delegates' concern, and I think it's meritorious of further discussion separate from potential passage of this bill.
Delegate Yancey, then Delegate Pogge.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, if I recall correctly, I think we have until the 18th to file all legislation, and there are opportunities to file bills into this session. If that is correct, and I think to the gentleman's point that if an additional language needs to be added, I'm certain someone can offer that bill accordingly. But
I believe the deadline for requests for drafts is already passed. That was Friday at 5 p.m.
if there's a brave
You could draft your own bill, that's true.
So I think to the gentleman's point, Mr. Chairman, I think that the bill is narrow in scope for the safety and security of the school on Election Day in November, which is what the issue is. We want to make certain that strangers are not walking around unnecessarily. So to the gentleman's point, I think the bill that's in the purview and the posture of this committee is such that we're honing in on school safety, and as such, if ameliorating language needs to be added, I'm sure it can be added in the proper sense where we still are in the current session. So I would just say that the gentleman just hold tight and just address the issue accordingly.
Thank you.
All right, Delegate Pogge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to add my concerns with Delegate Hurst that this ought to stand alone. It has been vetted, like Delegate Krizek said. We're taking care of the primaries. We're taking care of the November elections. In the May elections, many of the localities, the school boards already have built in a teacher work day for that election. And I think they have the power to do that, to ensure that students aren't in school that day. And for the most part, they already have that authority.
All right, I see all these people lined up. I'm assuming you want to speak to the amendment that we have before us. real quickly.
I'll withdraw the amendment.
All right, the patron of the amendment has just withdrawn the amendment. Does everybody want to speak on the amendment now that it's been withdrawn? The amendment has been withdrawn. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, David Bailey, I wish to speak in support of the bill for just a moment before the good folks behind me would speak. Usually in the school safety study with many of you, the hat I was wearing with Virginia School Counselor Association, they don't have a position on this bill, but the Virginia Registrars Association do, because they really need to use schools in practically all localities, and they are aware of the concerns that many Virginians have, that you all have and many have, about the safety of students. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, the only other comment I would make is that the language of the bill before you doesn't prohibit a teacher workday. It doesn't prohibit a parent-teacher conference day, which in some respects still would have plenty of people into the school while voting is going on. It just says it doesn't require students to attend. And so we would hope that you would report the bill, and we would hope that that would help keep schools available for polling places on election days. Thank you.
All right, anybody else wish to speak in favor of the bill?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Kathy Bircher with the Virginia Education Association. We're very supportive of the bill. Our members have long asked for this kind of protection. If you do vote in a polling place that's in a school, you realize how easy it is to leave the polling location, particularly in a school gym, unnoticed. I would encourage, and our members would like you to recognize the value of educators' lives as well. And so we certainly support the bill, but I think it's important to know that school safety does go beyond just students. We're supportive of this bill, but I think that's important to consider as well.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Jim Council, representing Prince William. The bill in its original form was a legislative priority of ours for a number of years until we gave up on it. So we're glad to see it brought back from a different...
Patience pays off.
That's right. So we're glad to see it back here, and we do support it in its original form.
That's what we have before us. Stacy?
Mr. Chairman, Stacey Haney of School Board Association. In its original form, my concerns are fewer. But I do still have a concern with the bill in its original form, and that is that the bill shuts down every school in the Commonwealth, and not every school in the Commonwealth is used as a polling place. So you might be going a little farther than you need to go, and so I would just bring that to the committee's attention. Thank you.
All right, any other questions by members of the committee? Anybody else in the audience wish to speak in opposition to the bill, other than the concerns raised? All right, what's your pleasure on House Bill 1752? All right, there's a motion and a second to report unamended House Bill 1752. All those in favor or opposed to reporting House Bill 1752, please record your vote on the electronic voting system. Have all members voted? Clerk will close the roll. That bill reports 19 to 1 and 19 to 1 opposed and 1 abstention. Thank you, Delegate Krizek.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, Delegate Rush, you have House Bill 1738 and House Bill 1739.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I believe if it's the committee's prerogative to take 1739 by for the day.
We can do that. Is there, our conversation before the meeting, there is a need to look at the language for the funding source, is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. This uses bonds, and there could be language in the bond contract that wouldn't allow for software. And so we're going to check on that, and I've got a couple ideas that we're going to run through bond counsel.
Without objection, we will take House Bill 1739 by for the day. All right, hearing no objection. House Bill 1738.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. House Bill 1738 is a recommendation of the School Safety Committee, and it simply requires that an architect who is trained in crime prevention through environmental designs to sign off on any new building plans or remodels of schools. The crime prevention through environmental design uses things like sight distance, natural cover, how you shape entrances into schools, ingress and egress, windows, how things such as playgrounds and sports facilities would be used. It looks at criminal behavior and then try to mitigate that through natural design.
All right, does any member of the committee have any questions for Delegate Rush regarding House Bill 1738?
Mr. Chairman.
All right, Delegate Bulova.
Yeah, just a quick question, and I want to make sure that we're not creating a unintended problem. Because
So do I.
I don't know how many architects and professional engineers are also trained in and experienced in crime prevention through environmental design. And so the way it's worded, it makes it sound like you're going to have one person who's going to do this. And I'd hate to narrow the universe down to just a few engineers and architects who are specifically trained in this. And I guess where I'm trying to come from is, can you actually have two people who are putting eyes on a plan? And so you might have the main architect and engineer, and then you ensure that there's an engineer who also is signing off that's trained in these areas. I just want to ensure that you're not narrowing this down to just one person and then having just a very small number of people who are going to be qualified to do this.
And Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, that's a very good question. In testimony we had throughout the summer, these are engineers who are designated with this. This designation's been around since the 60s. Obviously, it's been updated as patterns and criminal behavior and school shootings and stuff have happened. It's been updated, but this is a pretty prevalent in architecture. And you would be able to have a main architect that would sign off, and then someone certified in this field.
Great, thank you.
Well, I did have somebody else. I guess there's Delegate Turpin.
I'd like to speak to the bill just very quickly. I'm not sure. I spoke to an architect with VMDO, which is one of the leading K-12, and they're not sure about the training requirements. And then I reached out to UVA and UPenn and some other institutes about specifically architectural training in, the crime prevention aspect. And I don't know how they go about getting trained. Is there an avenue for architects to become trained in this?
Mr. Chairman, it's
Delegate Rush.
and what we learned throughout the summer and in my own studies was this is a designation. It's much like I'm in financial services, so there's all these designations that you can go get trained in and be certified in. And from my research and what was testified before the committee, this designation's been around since the 60s.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions for Delegate Rush? Is there anyone in the audience that wishes to speak in favor or in opposition to the legislation?
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Delegate Yancey.
Just briefly to the gentlelady's question and to Delegate Rush, have a piece of legislation that at some point will probably be either before rules or education, but to the gentlelady's inquiry, I am familiar with an architect association in the Commonwealth representing some of the architects who are familiar with this issue. And as I understand it, and I can't speak to the actual industry standards, but as I understand it, that they are familiar with this, that they are keeping up to date on a lot of this kind of information. And my guess would be that, based on some of the conversations that have been passed on to my office, that they are familiar with the type of security and the type of improvements upon schools or retrofitting of schools that would ameliorate this situation in order to guarantee more safety and security for the students and the teachers inside the schools. So just wanted to speak to the bill, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other questions? What's your pleasure on House Bill 1738? All right, there's a motion and a second to report House Bill 1738. All those in favor or opposed to reporting House Bill 1738, please record your vote on the electronic voting system. All members voted. Clerk will close the roll. That bill is reported 21-0.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Thank you. All right, next in the queue is Delegate O'Quinn with House Bill 1732. And
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 1732 is another one of the recommendations from the School Safety Committee, and this relates to training for emergency situations on school property. In Code Section 22.1, there are already certain trainings that are set forth, and this would add the emergency situation on school property to that. Was determined that it would be better if determined locally by the school board rather than having just one model to necessarily come from Richmond, given that we have lots of unique school systems and lots of unique school buildings. So that's the bill, and happy to answer any questions.
All right, I believe there's a substitute.
There is, yes, sir.
If Ryan can hand that out. And I understand in reading the substitute, basically what we're doing is, if you look in the original bill, we say each public elementary and secondary school principal shall develop and deliver. And what we're now saying with the substitute is each school board shall develop training and safety procedures. In other words, to accomplish exactly what Delegate O'Quinn just mentioned.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. And there is a version of this bill on the Senate side as well. So
this would conform this bill to the Senate version?
Yes, sir. Okay. And talking to the various stakeholders, I think going with the school board route may be the better way to go. So.
All right, I'll let everybody take a look at that real quickly before we consider the substitute. Do any members have any questions regarding the substitute? Has everybody had a chance to kind of look at it? All right. Is there a motion on adopting the substitute for House Bill 1732? All right, there's a motion and a second to adopt the substitute for House Bill 1732. Any questions by members on the substitute? All those in favor of adopting the substitute for House Bill 1732, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed? All right, that substitute is before us. Any questions for Delegate O'Quinn regarding to our newly revised House Bill 1732? Delegate Rodman.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with this one, and I just wanted, so there'll be drills, and then is this just training among, or is it like just to make sure there's an annual drill? I just want to separate the idea between training and drills, and it's just not clear to me. So if you can just make it a little bit more what the purpose of the bill is.
Yeah, I think the purpose of the bill is to add this particular emergency situation drill to the list of tornado, fire, et cetera, drills that are done on an annual basis. And I think that the codes, the 22.1 and the other drills sets forth, and I believe that there's language in there that those are annual trainings.
Mr. Chairman?
Delegate Rodman.
So this is just to ensure maybe that at least one drill is happening a year? Is that kind of the gist of it?
It is, and I think in some school divisions, maybe it is being done, and others it isn't. So to ensure that it is done at least once per year.
Okay.
I know that some school divisions do various trainings multiple times per year, and there's certainly nothing to stop them from doing that, but at least once a year.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Delegate Robinson. Oh, yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess my question is, and maybe this is already done and my question is not really needed, but so the school board will develop the plan, right? But each individual school is different. So how is that adapted for each individual school? Will the principals then still adapt those plans to their school? And maybe that's not even relevant to this.
Mr. Chairman, I think it is relevant, absolutely. And I think that was the intent of having this decision and the training made at the county and city level rather than just us sitting here and saying these are the 5 things you need to do, so that it can be localized and then can be adapted to specific schools if it has to be. And I think with the school board making the plan, if there needed to be a variance for one specific school, then they would have that in their purview to include that in the training.
Okay, Delegate Hurst.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Delegate O'Quinn, can you speak to the committee a little bit about some of the experiences that you went through during this past calendar year as a member of the Select Committee on School Safety? Because I think it would be important for us to know about some of the things that you found in terms of a level of parity across all schools and all school divisions, and particularly in some rural areas where this might not be done, just trying to bring up a standard statewide.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, one of the things that I certainly found, and I think that probably several colleagues did as well, is that everyone is well-intentioned. Not everyone is necessarily doing everything that they could be doing, and a lot of times that's not, there's nothing nefarious there. It's just sort of something that maybe gets taken for granted, or something that people have the attitude of, nothing bad's ever going to happen here. We're in the middle of the country. But I think we did find that the process and the rules and everything else are disjointed enough that some of these things do merit having a more statewide standard, and I think this is one of those things.
Okay, any other questions for Delegate O'Quinn? Is there anyone in the audience that wishes to speak in favor or in opposition to House Bill 1732? Crickets, okay. What's your pleasure on the substitute for House Bill 1732? All right, there's a motion and a second to report House Bill 1732 as a substitute. All those in favor or opposed to reporting the substitute, please record your vote on the electronic voting system. All right. All members voted. Clerk will close the roll. That bill reports 20-0. Delegate O'Quinn, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm next up on the queue, but I'm going to take Delegate Gilbert's bill next since he's here. House Bill 1733. Delegate Gilbert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning.
Good morning.
Members of the committee. House Bill 1733 requires local school boards who have school resource officers in their schools to enter into memorandums of, or memoranda of understanding with such local law enforcement agencies who employ those school resource officers. I think the idea behind this, and this is a recommendation of the Select Committee on School Safety, Mr. Chairman, was that there were instances where perhaps the expectation of the school system as to how a law enforcement officer should behave in a particular situation, or how they should react rather to a particular situation, should be one thing, and the agency or the law enforcement professional perhaps viewed it differently. And I think conversely, the expectations of the officers, with respect to the school system, can be clouded as well. So this simply puts everybody on the same page, such as it is, so that the various entities understand what one another's responsibilities and expectations are. You could see a situation where a school system would be involved in a disciplinary issue rather than a criminal issue, and expect maybe the law enforcement officer to participate in that, and that may go beyond the mandate of the agency, and vice versa. So that's the idea, Mr. Chairman, and to provide additional clarity in these in allowing those officers to better, fulfill their role and protect our students.
All right, does anybody have questions for Delegate Gilbert? All right, does anyone in the audience wish to speak in favor of House Bill 1733?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Kathy Bircher with the Virginia Education Association, and we support the bill.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Amy Willard with Legal Aid Justice Center. We do support the bill. I just want to sort of flag for the committee some suggestions around language to make sure that this is a document that's able to be implemented by the folks on the ground who need to implement it. So making sure school staff and the SROs in the building know its contents and it doesn't just sort of become a document on a shelf, I think would be really helpful. And the 5-year review period, from our perspective, 5 years is a really long time. We have technology that gets invented and shelved within 5 years, so perhaps either considering bringing that down a little bit or offering a path to reviewing the document by one agency or another ahead of those 5 years. Just something for the committee to consider, but I want to thank Delegate Gilbert for bringing the bill and the committee for bringing this to the full committee's attention. We do support the bill.
Okay, thank you. Anybody that wishes to speak in opposition to the bill? Delegate Gilbert.
Mr. Chairman, just in full disclosure, I think Delegate Van Valkenburg has a similar bill that embodies the principles that were just articulated at the podium, namely the 2-year instead of the 5-year entering into the agreement or renewing the agreement, and then the additional language that requires the document to be reviewed with staff that would be affected by it. Those are fairly innocuous differences on their face. I am concerned a little bit about requiring. I think 2 years is a little too often, perhaps, and that's its own thing, and that's a policy consideration for the committee whether you wanted to do 2 or 5 years. I think certainly 5 years seems fine to me, Mr. Chairman. But anyway, so that's one policy consideration, and then the other is relating to notifying all the potentially affected staff of the contents of that memorandum of understanding. My concern there, again, innocuous enough on its face, no reason why everybody shouldn't know what the expectations are on both sides. I'm a little concerned about the liability aspect of that if, there could be an instance where a custodian needs to go get the law enforcement officer, and maybe he didn't get the 2-year training update on what the MOU says, and then that could be a potential liability that was not gone over with all of the potentially affected personnel. And I'm doing my courts thing where we think of all the what ifs right now, so I apologize. I'm not asking for that change, but I'm certainly not offended by it. I just do have concerns about, having to go all the way down and make sure that every single person knows every single detail. Although I understand the intent behind it, I think there are maybe some unintended consequences there.
Delegate Van Valkenburg.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, so maybe to split the difference between the patron on the time difference, my bill says the school board and local law enforcement agency shall A, review the memorandum of understanding every 2 years or at any time upon the request of either party, and may revise such memorandum at any time as agreed by the parties. So if it's 5 years, but there is a trigger where the locality, one party can come and say, hey, we need a change. So the example I would give is 2 years ago, jewels were not everywhere, and now they are. And so maybe law enforcement says, hey, we want some clarity about when we're supposed to step in here and when this is just admin. And so it would keep the 5 years, but provide a trigger if.
Sure. That's, again, this
Delegate
is a policy
Van Valkenburg, do you want to
consideration
propose an amendment?
Sure, so I guess I would propose an amendment, and it would say, it would be at line.
I think council has already anticipated your proposed amendment. So would ask Mr. Bremer to maybe talk about your proposed amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Delegate Van Valkenburg. So it would just, as you said, Delegate, capture some of the language from your bill and bring it into Delegate Gilbert. So on line 17, after at least once every 5 years, insert or at any time upon the request of either party. Yeah, I think that would cover it.
Okay, Delegate Van Valkenburg, are you proposing that amendment?
So proposed.
All right, is there a second? All right, there's a second. Delegate Gilbert, does that sound understandable to you?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. All right, any discussion on that proposed amendment? Anybody in the audience? Okay. All those in favor of adopting that line amendment, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Okay. Delegate Van Valkenburg.
Mr. Chair, and I understand Delegate Gilbert's concern about the second part. Would it be better if, rather than say, it says ensure that all relevant personnel employed, would it be better if it said school administrators and the school resource officer, so it was clear about who was expected to see it?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I've never thought, it certainly doesn't make any sense to have a memorandum of understanding if nobody has ever read it, which leads me to believe that common sense dictates that the contents of the MOU would be distributed to the people who would be most likely to have to be aware of it. So I'm hesitant to put a requirement there that seems like something that everybody's going to do anyway, when if they failed to do it in a particular instance, it could add additional liability to either party. So I just sort of have that general concern. I don't know how you resolve that.
Okay. I don't hear any other amendments at this point. All right. Anybody else have any questions regarding House Bill 1733? All right, hearing none, what's your pleasure? The motion and a second to report as amended House Bill 1733. All those in favor or opposed to reporting House Bill 1733 as amended, please record your vote on the electronic voting system. All members voted. Clerk will close the roll. That bill reports 18-0.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Delegate Gilbert.
Thank you.
And I'm going to turn the gavel over to our Vice Chairman so I can go down and present. Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Landis, House Bill 1729, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, what House Bill 1729 will do is basically set a ratio for our school counselors to make sure that 80% of their time is spent actually counseling students. And 20% would be left at the school's discretion for other duties and assignments, like obviously working with students related to college preparation and the like. Mr. Chairman, the Select Committee on School Safety, I think, made this one of their top priorities because one of the issues that we found in our studies is that, one, school counselors are trained for counseling students related to behavioral health and emotional issues, but that they don't, in fact, in most cases, have the time to actually spend with students because of the other duties that school systems and public schools have started to ask them to do more and more and more. So what we're attempting to do is to get them back to their focus and their responsibilities. My estimation and belief is that if school counselors working with other professionals in the community can get to students earlier related to emotional or behavioral health issues, we would stave off students acting violently against themselves in the case of suicide or others in the case of what we've seen with shootings or other violent acts that have occurred in schools. We've been very fortunate in Virginia that we've not seen any incidences like that from the standpoint of school shootings and the like, but if we don't do something to proactively get our school counselors back to assisting students related to these issues, that obviously could occur in Virginia as well. And I think in many of the incidents we've seen nationwide, it has been identified that these young people, in many cases, have demonstrated that they need help, that they have issues, that either their families or that the school really has not addressed. And the way to address that is to get our school counselors working with students on a regular basis, identifying those problems, and then working with services in the community for not only them but also their families to make sure we stave off those problems. So that's what we're attempting to do, Mr. Chairman. This, before you, I have got a substitute that would incorporate Delegate Van Valkenburg's idea, and that is something that the school counselors also support, to basically change the nomenclature of what school counselors, and we call school counselors, to remove, and I think Ryan's going to pass out the substitute, but when you look at it, the original portion of my bill is on page 13, lines 327 through 329, but then if you look throughout the legislation, if you look at that page above, where we basically simply change and strike the word high school or guidance counselors and then refer to the high school counselors in the future. And that's all that the substitute does. So it basically incorporates my bill and deals with the nomenclature issue, which I agree needs to be done, and is something. And it seemed like if we're going to move this legislation forward, we might as well start in the posture of having it in the correct terminology that I believe everybody understands and knows at this point. So that's with full disclosure what the substitute does, Mr. Chairman, and would hope the committee would favorably look upon both the substitute and the legislation.
Thank you, Chairman Landis. Any questions about the substitute? If not, we need to accept the substitute. Moved and seconded to accept the substitute. All in favor, please say aye. Opposed? The substitute is before us. Are there questions for the patron from members of this committee? I see people looking at me. Delegate Sullivan, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for the chairman. I'm looking at the FIS. There's no impact to the state. What did you hear from localities during your hearings, Mr. Chairman, about the effect this would have, the challenges, if any, it would pose to them from either a fiscal or a sort of a logistics standpoint?
There is potentially, obviously, an impact on localities. Looking at the fiscal impact statement, there isn't any to the state per se, and that's why there wasn't a letter from the Speaker to have this bill referred to appropriations. But in all full disclosure, there is going to be some impact potentially on localities. Many localities have other support staff or, in many cases, testing coordinators that can take on the responsibility. In many cases, guidance counselors or school counselors basically are test administrators. So what we're looking at from the standpoint of appropriations, I can tell you, is trying to come up with some resources, either dealing with the ratio, which is something that it will be considered at some point, or in moving in that direction, or to allow schools more flexibility so that they could use other staff through some additional funding to try to address that. So we are looking at that. I can't tell you there's going to be a perfect solution. It all depends on the resources that we have. And I remind members that I serve on the House Appropriations Committee, not the House Finance Committee. So those of you that serve on the House Finance Committee will get to determine those additional resources or not. But if there are additional resources, I think that's something that I know I've talked to Chairman Jones about, that we would like to see something to deal with as part of the recommendation, either a pool of money or providing some flexibility for school systems to be able to have other people take on those responsibilities.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad to hear it. Thank you.
Are there further questions for the patron from the committee members? Yes, Delegate Tyler.
Thank you. I have a question and a comment. I had an opportunity to attend the public hearing on the governor's budget, and we had a lot of comments from counselors who were requesting more time and more resources to help them address the mental issues that's happening in the classroom. But my question is, why did you prefer to use 80% rather than a certain number of hours?
Delegate Tyler, that's a great question. What we heard from testimony is that the school systems needed some flexibility, and that's why the 20% is there, because they do have other responsibilities. But all school counselors would like to spend 100% of the time counseling students, but we realize that these are positions that need some flexibility. So the subcommittee recommended, based on what we heard from counselors, what was a good ratio. And this seemed to be the best ratio that we could come up with that directs the majority of their time, obviously the vast majority of their time was actually counseling students, but at the same time providing some flexibility so that part of the time they can handle other responsibilities and the like. So it's not a perfect ratio, obviously. I don't know that there is ever a perfect ratio, but we felt like this would address the key issue, and that is allowing them to spend the vast majority of their time with students.
Delegate Bourne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for bringing this bill forward as part of the Select Committee. It was certainly a great piece of work that came out of there. And I don't really have a question, Mr. Chairman. Just a comment that while I think to the point of resources about switching from 80 to 20 is certainly a component of how we get a safer and better school environment. I do think it's important just to note, and we'll hear it in the next subcommittee, that the other piece of this, the other side of this coin is reducing the caseload for our counselors so that we really begin to take the steps to go from 1 to 500 to 1 to 250, however we can get there, because if we're spending more time, if our counselors are spending more time counseling and they're counseling less students, they get more quality, higher quality interactions with the students, and I think that's what we all want. So thank you for handling this piece of it, Mr. Chairman.
I look at this as the first step, not the last step.
Any further questions from committee members? If not, is there anyone in the audience who'd like to speak in favor of the bill?
Mr. Chairman, each of you members of the committee, David Bailey speaking on behalf of the Virginia School Counselor Association. We fully support this bill. At an appropriate time in the subcommittee, we support another bill that would add more counselors and give them a better ratio of working with students. Mr. Chairman, in addressing the question perhaps that Delegate Tyler was raising, certainly the 80% as a standard is an increase in the amount of time that would be allocated for the counseling with students and working with groups of students. So we support this. I'm sure teachers would like to have 100% of their time teaching, and counselors would like to have 100% of their time counseling, but this is significant, and we thank you and fully support the bill.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Amy Willard with Legal Aid Justice Center. We also thank Delegate Landis for bringing this piece of the bill and support it, but sort of echo the comments of Delegate Bourne that this is sort of one piece of a multi-piece puzzle that really needs to go forward in order for our students to really feel the good effects of these counselors and for the counselors themselves to be able to do their jobs effectively. You may see fewer school discipline bills from me if this goes forward, so I would just sort of add that as a caveat too, but appreciate the work of the School Safety Committee, and we do support the bill.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and on behalf of the Virginia Counselors Association and the Alliance for School Counseling, we also support this bill and also the efforts to reduce the numbers of students for whom counselors are responsible. It's a very important step, we believe, in moving the needle toward better health and for our students so that they can learn and be educated to the maximum. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Chairman. I'm Emily Griffey with Voices for Virginia's Children. Voices leads the campaign for a trauma-informed Virginia, and we appreciate the work of the School Safety Committee to look at the mental health and wellness of students. We support this effort to improve the time that counselors spend with students, as well as the effort to reduce the ratio of counselors to students. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Stacey Haney of the School Board Association. I was trying to slide in between the support and the opposition, if there is any. I'd like to be able to support the bill. I like the idea of the bill, but I think it's important to remember that school boards have not piled these additional duties on school counselors because we don't want school counselors counseling students. School counselors have had these duties added to them because we do not have adequate support staff in our schools to do all of the things that we need to do and to do all the things that the General Assembly has required us to do. So if the General Assembly wants to have school counselors counseling students, then this General Assembly has got to do something about the support staff cap. If we don't add additional funding for new support staff, then what this bill is an unfunded mandate, which we adamantly oppose. But if this is a piece of a bigger picture in which there is additional funding for additional support staff, then that is the direction that we need to go in. And I'll just add that adding additional counselors and bringing down that ratio is also a positive step. But don't forget, all of those counselors are also going to be required to spend their time counseling students. So that doesn't alleviate the problem that I'm raising with support staff. So if we want our councils to counsel, if we want our teachers to teach, and if we want school divisions to do the things that we all want them to do, we've got to fund additional positions in our schools. Thank you.
I think that's a fair point.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Kathy Bircher with the Virginia Education Association. The VEA is very supportive of the ratio change from 60% to 80%. We are very supportive of additional counseling services in our buildings. Just last night, our legislative committee met, and they directed me to make sure that the committee is aware that if we do change the ratios, much like you just heard from Ms. Haney, we are very concerned that those responsibilities, some of the test coordinator responsibilities, some of the other pieces will be assigned to the classroom teacher simply because the staff isn't there. And without an appropriation, this does become a burden on our classroom teachers. Again, we are incredibly grateful for all of the work that's been done to really address the mental health of our students, particularly around putting the kinds of services in place that we know that will help them in their mental health issues, but also in the counseling piece for where should I go after school, after I graduate. But without an appropriation, we're concerned that this would fall on teachers.
Mr. Chairman, Tom Smith, Superintendent's Association. I could easily just say ditto with this, but I did want to make one follow-up comment to the one on funding and added staff. As being one of those folks who used to sit in an office in Palmyra, Virginia, and try to do what you all decide that we should do, we are supportive of counselors. Superintendents across the Commonwealth recognize the importance of counselors, but we're making major changes here. And in doing that, we ask for not only the funding, but the flexibility to make those changes and be able to provide the services in a quality way without a lot of disruption or having to move things around. But thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. Trolling Seward, longtime education advocate. And I, once upon a time, before my hair got so gray, was an elementary counselor and was a high school counselor. One of the important functions that I found that we performed, and I just want to be sure that we're not cutting that out with terminology, is the elementary counselors were the ones who did this, but we had what they called classroom guidance. And you were in the classroom, and maybe your topic this week was bullying. So in all the classrooms, you had little lessons during the week about how to react if children were bullying each other. When character education came into play, the school counselors often did lessons that involved respect or responsibility, some of these kinds of things. So I just wanted to be sure that when we say direct counseling of individual students or groups of students, that we weren't cutting out that classroom function. So nobody's going to. Okay, that's what I was going to ask. If somebody, so that somebody got technical, they wouldn't. Okay, that was just my question. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'm Jonna Cosboon. I'm with Chesapeake Public Schools, and we have some concerns about the bill that it doesn't specify who's going to audit and monitor and who's going to be responsible for that, and how they're going to look at it. So that's it. Thank you.
Anyone else wish to speak to the bill? Chairman Landis?
Mr. Chairman, I think some good points were raised. We dealt with the issue of funding. That's a separate issue, obviously. Appropriations will have to deal with that. But I think most importantly, I think we've tried to address a lot of the concerns. The question about auditing, I think we tried to make the language flexible, so we're not trying to put an additional onus on school systems, but obviously this is a goal, and I think this is the best way to approach it from that standpoint. I do think the issue of whether a counselor can go into a classroom, I think with the definition of groups, I think a group of students, obviously, whether it's a small group or a larger group, I think would be covered. I think we anticipate that counselors obviously will do that. And if it's bullying or it's other issues, that would be direct contact with students. So that's what we're trying to promote, and that's what I think we're trying to accomplish.
Delegate Van Valkenburg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this bill. I think of all the bills we're talking about today, this is the one that'll have the biggest impact on school safety. And I do agree that I hope this is part of a bigger picture where we're looking at more things, and I think we've heard encouraging words that it is. I would just add that I don't want to lose track of the sight that when we invest in people and in counselors and in support staff, we're not just making schools safer, which is obviously important, especially today and what we're dealing with, but this also will have a huge academic impact. The more counselors are counseling students and the more counselors and the lower the caseload they have, discipline problems go down, the achievement gap goes down, and academic achievement goes up. And so I think it's important that we also note that piece to this bill.
And Mr. Chairman, to respond to Delegate Van Valkenburg's, I think, great point, many counselors help students deal with the pressure of just the academic load that they have, a boyfriend or a girlfriend or those other issues that are out there that we all know teenagers are experiencing. I've got a 16-year-old at home, a junior, and I can tell you we suggest that he talks to the school counselor and his teachers about some of these issues as well and let them know when he feels like he's under stress or having pressure. And I think that's the kind of involvement that school counselors have and that can have and that students need. So I agree 100% that it's a public safety issue, but they do a lot more than just try to deal with the emotional or behavioral issues sometimes that are the issues that we see that we're trying to deal with, but other issues as well.
Thank you, Chairman Landis. The chair will entertain a motion. I have a motion to report, properly seconded. Any further discussion? Hearing none, please cast your vote. The motion carries 18-0.
Thank you, Delegate Bell. All right, members, that is the last bit of business we have on our agenda today, but we do have a couple announcements that I want to make. First of all, Delegate Sullivan, I was really neglectful in not mentioning that you are a member of the committee now, and I was trying to get into the business at hand, and I completely forgot. But welcome to the committee. We really appreciate your involvement, and I appreciate your questions already.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's really a great honor to serve on this committee, which does such important work. You can all just call me Jennifer.
And then the other thing I will note that you have, I think, received the updated subcommittee assignment list so that it will reflect that Delegate Sullivan is now on subcommittee number 2. Nothing else has changed. And Delegate McGuire has asked that he be able to make an announcement one more time.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you. Many of you have heard that we're doing a lot of things here in education committees to help our education system. I think our children are number one. I think everybody in this room would agree with that. And there are many things that we can do, but I think if you feel like you're appreciated, you're more likely to do a better job and stick around. And it's a small step in the right direction. But we have a Virginia Loves Teachers license plate, and we all have a favorite teacher. And I can imagine a teacher pulls up to a Food Lion and sees a school bus yellow license plate with an apple and a ruler on it. I guess it's going to put a smile on their face. So we need 450 signatures by January 31st. We're about halfway there. But I figure with this audience, you guys have a big network of teachers who would be interested, or even parents or anyone else. The great thing about this license plate idea, it's only $10. You click a button online, and it's the simplest one they've ever done in the General Assembly. I've got my legislative aide, Zach, Whirl in the back, he's passing out pictures of this so you can see what it is. But all of you guys have teacher networks, and if you guys could share it, we'd appreciate it. I'm very appreciative to see that Governor Northam's wife went on Twitter and put a shout out to teachers and said that we should all get behind this. So any effort or help you can make, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. That's the only business we have. The full committee will hear subcommittee reports. Our subcommittees have been meeting. In fact, there's a subcommittee meeting, I believe, right after adjournment of this committee meeting. So we will hear subcommittee reports and potentially a couple presentations on Monday after we hear those reports. So with that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. There's a motion and a second. All those in favor of adjourning the committee, please say aye. All those opposed. Committee is adjourned.